In the face of a devastating California wildfire, Bailey, a loyal and courageous shepherd dog, became the unlikely hero of the Miller family farm. As flames consumed the surrounding forest, Bailey led the Millers' entire herd of sheep and cows through treacherous terrain to safety, overcoming falling debris, raging fire lines, and even a pack of coyotes. Bailey's bravery and intelligence never faltered. When they reached safety at the evacuation zone, Bailey's story captured the hearts of everyone he met. The local community honored him for his heroic actions, presenting him with a medal that recognized his extraordinary courage. Back at the farm, Bailey continued his role as protector and leader, helping the Millers rebuild and inspiring everyone with his unwavering loyalty. Bailey's journey became a symbol of hope, resilience, and the incredible bond between humans and animals. His story inspired others to value their connection with animals and raised awareness about the role animals can play in times of crisis. What do you think about Bailey's heroic story? Does it inspire you as much as it inspires us? Let us know where you're watching from and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to DG Story for more heartwarming and inspiring tales. Hit the notification bell to ensure you never miss another unforgettable story. The Miller family farm sat at the edge of a sprawling forest in California, surrounded by fields of golden grass and dotted with sturdy wooden fences. It was a peaceful place where life moved at a steady rhythm. John and Linda Miller, a hard-working couple in their 50s, had built the farm from the ground up, pouring their hearts into raising livestock and maintaining their land. Among their most prized companions was Bailey, a loyal border collie with sharp instincts and an unwavering sense of duty. Bailey had been with them for years, growing from a playful pup into the steadfast guardian of the farm. The sheep and cows seemed to trust him completely, following his guidance without hesitation. On this particular morning, however, the tranquility of the farm was disrupted. A dry wind swept through the fields, carrying an unsettling scent. Bailey's ears perked up, his nose twitching as he caught the faint but distinct smell of smoke. Linda noticed Bailey's sudden change in demeanor. "What is it, boy?" she asked, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. But Bailey didn't respond the way he usually did. Instead, he barked twice, a sharp, urgent sound that made Linda's heart skip a beat. By midday, the news arrived. A wildfire had broken out in the nearby forest, spreading rapidly due to strong winds and dry conditions. Authorities were urging residents in the area to prepare for evacuation. John paced the porch, his phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with neighbors. "It's moving faster than they thought," he said to Linda, his voice grim. "We have to get ready." Linda nodded, her face pale but determined. "What about the livestock?" John glanced at the grazing fields where their sheep and cows wandered peacefully, unaware of the looming danger. "We'll do what we can, but we can't save them all. We need to focus on getting ourselves out of here safely." Bailey, sensing the urgency in their voices, darted toward the fields. He barked loudly, circling the animals in his usual herding pattern. The sheep bleated nervously, and the cows began to gather closer together, as if they understood Bailey's unspoken command. Inside the farmhouse, Linda hurriedly packed essentials, photo albums, important documents, and a few cherished keepsakes. John loaded the truck with supplies, casting worried glances toward the sky, which had turned an ominous shade of orange. "We don't have much time," he said, slamming the truck's tailgate shut. Linda looked toward the fields, her chest tightening. "We can't just leave them." John placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll do what we can, but we can't risk our lives. Bailey's doing his best to gather them. If anyone can lead them to safety, it's him." Bailey barked in agreement, his sharp eyes focused on the task at hand. With smoke now visible on the horizon, John opened the gates to the main pasture. "Go, Bailey," he shouted, his voice breaking with urgency. Bailey bolted forward, his movements quick and precise as he herded the sheep and cows toward the open gate. The animals, though frightened, obeyed him instinctively. Linda watched in awe. "He knows what to do," she whispered. John nodded. "He always does." As the last of the livestock moved through the gate, Bailey paused to look back at the Millers. His expression was almost human, a mix of determination and reassurance. "Go with them, Bailey," John shouted. "Keep them safe." Bailey barked once, a clear acknowledgement, before turning to lead the herd away from the approaching flames. The Millers climbed into their truck, the roar of the fire growing louder behind them. As they drove away, Linda watched Bailey through the rearview mirror. He was a small but resolute figure, guiding the herd down the dirt road that led away from the farm. Tears filled her eyes. "He's risking everything for them." John tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw set. "He's doing what he was born to do." As the smoke thickened and the fire drew closer, Bailey's silhouette disappeared from view. But the Millers held on to hope, believing in the courage and loyalty of the dog they had come to rely on so deeply. The sun hung low in the sky, its golden light dimmed by the thick veil of smoke. Bailey trotted ahead of the herd, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon for danger. Behind him, the sheep and cows moved as one, their usual meandering replaced with a sense of urgency. The dirt road stretched out before them, lined with dry grass that crackled under their hooves. The wildfire loomed ominously in the distance, its fiery glow casting eerie shadows across the landscape. Bailey knew instinctively that they had to move quickly. One of the younger lambs stumbled on the uneven ground, letting out a frightened bleat. Bailey was at its side in an instant, nudging it gently with his nose to help it back to its feet. The lamb hesitated, then scrambled to rejoin the group, its small legs working furiously to keep up. The herd trusted Bailey implicitly. His presence was a constant reassurance, even as the smoke thickened and the distant roar of flames grew louder. As the group continued down the road, Bailey suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, and his nose twitched as he caught an unfamiliar scent. Ahead, a large tree had fallen across the path, its branches still smoldering. The sheep and cows hesitated, their movements jittery as they sensed the obstacle. Bailey barked sharply, running back and forth along the road as he assessed the situation. From a distance, John had been watching through a pair of binoculars. He and Linda had parked their truck on a nearby hill to keep an eye on the herd's progress. "There's something blocking the path," John said, lowering the binoculars. Linda's brow furrowed with worry. "Do you think Bailey can handle it?" John nodded, his voice steady. "If anyone can figure it out, it's him." Bailey moved to the side of the road, sniffing the air and examining the surrounding area. To the left, the ground sloped steeply down to a dry creek bed. It wasn't an ideal route, but it offered a way around the fallen tree. He barked once, a clear signal to the herd. Slowly, the animals began to follow him, their hooves crunching against the rocky slope. Bailey stayed close, darting back and forth to guide stragglers and ensure no one was left behind. The descent was slow and treacherous. Loose rocks shifted beneath their weight, and the smoke made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But Bailey's steady presence kept the group moving, his sharp barks cutting through the chaos. When they finally reached the bottom of the creek bed, the herd paused to regroup. Bailey walked among them, his tail wagging slightly as if to say, "We're not done yet, but we're getting there." The journey was far from over, but Bailey's determination was unwavering. The creek bed offered temporary relief from the encroaching flames, but the path ahead was anything but simple. The dry stream twisted and turned, its rocky terrain littered with fallen branches and patches of ash. Bailey led the way with unyielding focus, his sharp eyes scanning for potential dangers. One of the cows hesitated at a narrow section of the creek where the walls rose steeply on either side. The large animal let out a low, anxious moo, its hooves scraping against the loose rocks. Bailey turned back, barking sharply to encourage the cow forward. When it still didn't move, he trotted over and nipped gently at its hind leg, urging it to take the first step. The cow eventually complied, carefully navigating the narrow passage as the rest of the herd followed close behind. As the group moved deeper into the creek bed, the smoke thickened, the air grew heavy, and the animals began to show signs of distress. Some of the sheep bleated nervously, their movements becoming more erratic. Bailey darted among them, barking softly to keep them calm. His presence acted as a stabilizing force, preventing the herd from descending into chaos. Above them, the sky was a murky orange, the wildfire's glow illuminating the tops of the cliffs. Linda, watching from the hilltop with binoculars, clenched her hands together. "The fire's getting closer," she said, her voice tinged with fear. John nodded, his expression grim. "Come on, Bailey," he muttered under his breath. "You can do this." Suddenly, a small lamb broke away from the group, its tiny legs carrying it toward a side path that branched off the main creek bed. The animal was clearly disoriented, its frightened bleats echoing through the canyon. Bailey noticed immediately, without hesitation. He sprinted after the lamb, his agile body weaving through the herd. The sheep and cows watched as he disappeared around the bend, their movements slowing in confusion. The lamb had become stuck between two rocks, its small frame trembling as it struggled to free itself. Bailey approached cautiously, his tail wagging slightly to reassure the frightened animal. With a gentle tug of his teeth, Bailey freed the lamb and nudged it back toward the main group. The lamb hesitated for a moment, its wide eyes fixed on Bailey, before finally following him back to the herd. When Bailey returned with the lamb, the rest of the herd seemed to relax, their nervous bleating subsiding. Lucy and John, watching from a distance, let out sighs of relief. "He's incredible," Linda said softly. John nodded, his eyes never leaving Bailey. "That dog's doing more than we ever could." Bailey barked once, a sound filled with determination, before continuing down the creek bed. He knew they still had a long way to go, but his loyalty and courage wouldn't allow him to stop. The journey through the creek bed began to take its toll on the herd. The sheep's wool was matted with soot, and the cows moved more slowly, their heavy breaths visible in the smoky air. Bailey, though visibly tired, showed no signs of giving up. He darted back and forth, ensuring the animals stayed together. His sharp barks echoed against the canyon walls, providing a steady rhythm that urged the herd forward. At the back of the group, a large ewe began to lag behind, her steps faltering. Bailey noticed immediately and circled back. He nudged her gently with his nose, barking softly as if to encourage her. The ewe gave a tired bleat but continued moving, her trust in Bailey evident. The path ahead opened into a wide, rocky plain, but the fire was advancing quickly. Bailey stopped at the edge of the creek bed, his ears perked as he scanned the terrain. The flames were visible now, licking at the edges of the plain. John and Linda watched anxiously from the hill. "They're almost out," John said, gripping the binoculars tightly. "But that fire's moving fast." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "Come on, Bailey," she whispered. "Get them out of there." Bailey barked sharply, rallying the herd for a final push. The sheep and cows followed him onto the plain, their movements hurried as they sensed the danger. Halfway across, a loud crack split the air. A burning tree on the edge of the plain began to topple, its massive trunk crashing to the ground and blocking part of the herd's path. Bailey reacted instantly. He ran to the front of the group, barking and nipping at the animals to guide them around the obstacle. The herd moved as one, their trust in Bailey driving them forward. After what felt like an eternity, the herd finally reached a grassy knoll on the far side of the plain. The fire was still visible in the distance, but for now, they were safe. Bailey stood at the top of the knoll, his chest heaving as he looked back at the path they had traveled. The sheep and cows began to graze tentatively, their movements slow and cautious. Bailey walked among them, his tail wagging slightly as he checked on each animal. From their vantage point on the hill, John and Linda could see the herd gathering on the knoll. Relief washed over them. "They made it," Linda said, her voice breaking. John nodded, a faint smile on his face. Thanks to Bailey. Bailey finally allowed himself to lie down, his body exhausted but his spirit unwavering. He had done his job, and though the journey wasn't over, he had ensured the safety of the herd for one more day. The sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the knoll. Bailey closed his eyes briefly, knowing that he would be ready to lead them again tomorrow if needed. The grassy knoll where the herd had gathered seemed safe for now, but the fire continued to rage in the distance, its fiery glow a constant reminder of the danger. Bailey, though exhausted, remained vigilant. He lay on his side, his ears twitching at every sound, ready to spring into action if needed. John and Linda had driven closer to the knoll, stopping at a nearby hill to get a better view. "They've made it this far," John said, scanning the horizon with binoculars. "But they can't stay there for long. The fire's shifting again." Linda nodded, worry etched into her face. "Bailey will figure it out. He always does." As night fell, the wind picked up, blowing hot and dry. The fire's glow grew brighter, and the smoke thickened, curling into ominous shapes in the dark sky. Bailey stood, sniffing the air. Something had changed. The animals began to stir uneasily, their instincts telling them that danger was near. A loud crack echoed through the night as another tree toppled somewhere in the distance. Bailey barked sharply, pacing along the edge of the knoll to keep the herd alert. John noticed the shift from his vantage point. "The fire's turning," he said, lowering the binoculars. "It's heading straight for them." The fire was closing in, and the grassy knoll, once a temporary haven, was no longer safe. Bailey sensed the urgency and began herding the animals once more, barking and nipping at their heels to get them moving. The herd was reluctant to leave their resting spot, but Bailey's determination was unyielding. Slowly, they began to follow him, their movements hesitant but obedient. Linda clutched John's arm as she watched. "Where is he taking them?" "To higher ground." "Maybe," John replied, his voice tense. "It's their best chance." Bailey led the herd toward a rocky incline that bordered the knoll. The path was narrow and steep, with loose rocks that made it difficult to climb. The sheep struggled to find footing, their bleats filled with fear, while the cows moved cautiously, their heavy hooves slipping on the uneven ground. One of the younger sheep stumbled and fell, letting out a panicked cry. Bailey was there in an instant, nudging it back onto its feet with his nose. The lamb trembled but managed to rejoin the group, following closely behind. The climb was grueling, and the fire's glow cast long, flickering shadows on the rocks. Bailey stayed at the front, his sharp eyes scanning for obstacles, while occasionally darting back to check on the stragglers. The animals were frightened, but Bailey's calm yet assertive presence kept them moving. He barked rhythmically, his voice cutting through the chaos like a guiding beacon. Halfway up the incline, a gust of wind sent a wave of embers toward the group. The animals panicked, their movements becoming frantic as they tried to escape the glowing sparks. Bailey worked tirelessly to keep them together, running back and forth to prevent any from straying. Despite the growing danger, Bailey's resolve never wavered. His focus was unshakable, his loyalty to the herd and his mission driving him forward. After a grueling climb, the herd finally reached the top of the rocky incline. The plateau offered a temporary reprieve, with open space and fewer immediate obstacles. The fire was still distant but growing closer with every gust of wind. Smoke hung thick in the air, and the faint sound of crackling flames served as a constant reminder of the encroaching danger. Bailey walked among the herd, his sharp eyes scanning for signs of distress. The animals were exhausted, their breaths labored, but they were safe for now. John and Linda, watching from the hill, felt a brief sense of relief. "He got them up there," Linda said, tears glistening in her eyes. "But it's not over," John replied grimly. He pointed toward the horizon where the fire's glow illuminated the dark sky. "They'll have to move again before long." As the animals settled on the plateau, a new danger emerged. A pack of coyotes, driven from their territory by the wildfire, prowled at the edge of the plateau. Their lean, hungry frames glinted in the faint light, and their eyes gleamed with desperation. Bailey noticed them immediately. His body tensed, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. He positioned himself between the herd and the coyotes, his tail stiff and his ears alert. The lead coyote stepped forward, its head low as it let out a sharp bark. The rest of the pack fanned out, their movements slow and deliberate as they tested Bailey's resolve. Bailey barked sharply, a warning that echoed across the plateau. The sheep and cows huddled together, their fear palpable as they sensed the predators nearby. The lead coyote lunged forward, but Bailey was ready. He darted to the side, snapping at the coyote's flank and forcing it to retreat. The other coyotes hesitated, their movements cautious as they circled the herd. John, watching through binoculars, clenched his fists. "Coyotes," he muttered. "He's outnumbered." Linda's face was pale. "What can we do?" "We have to trust him," John said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. Bailey's barks grew louder and more aggressive, his stance firm as he held his ground. One by one, the coyotes tested him, darting forward only to be met with swift and decisive retaliation. Despite his smaller size, Bailey's determination and agility gave him the advantage. He moved with precision, defending the herd without hesitation. The standoff lasted several tense minutes, but eventually, the coyotes began to retreat. Their desperation couldn't overcome Bailey's relentless defense. When the last coyote disappeared into the shadows, Bailey barked once more, his tail wagging slightly as he turned back to the herd. The animals began to relax, their nervous bleating subsiding as Bailey walked among them, ensuring they were unharmed. John lowered the binoculars, his voice filled with awe. "He did it," he said. Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He's protecting them like they're his own family." Bailey, though tired, remained alert. He knew the danger wasn't over yet. The plateau, though providing a temporary sanctuary, was now being threatened as the fire crept closer. The crackling of flames grew louder, and the sky turned an ominous red, casting the plateau in an eerie glow. The herd, sensing the approaching danger, began to stir anxiously. Bailey stood at the edge of the plateau, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. He could see the fire line advancing, fueled by dry brush and gusting winds. He barked sharply, circling the herd to gather them together. From their vantage point, John and Linda could see the peril their animals faced. "It's too close," Linda said, gripping John's arm. "They have to move now." John clenched his jaw. "Bailey knows what he's doing. He'll get them out of there." Bailey began herding the animals down the far side of the plateau, where a narrow path wound through the rocks. The terrain was treacherous, with loose stones and steep drops on either side, but it was their only option. The sheep moved cautiously, their hooves slipping on the uneven ground. Bailey barked constantly, guiding them forward and keeping the herd together. One of the larger cows hesitated at the edge of a sharp turn, its large frame unsteady on the narrow path. Bailey ran to its side, nipping gently at its leg to encourage it forward. The cow let out a low moo, finally taking a hesitant step. The rest of the herd followed, their trust in Bailey overriding their fear. Halfway down the path, a gust of wind carried a wave of embers toward the group. The glowing sparks landed on the dry grass along the edge of the trail, igniting small flames that quickly began to spread. The herd panicked, their movements becoming frantic as the flames grew closer. One of the sheep bolted from the group, its frightened bleating echoing through the canyon. Bailey immediately gave chase, his agile body navigating the rocky terrain with ease. He caught up to the sheep, barking sharply to redirect it back to the group. The sheep hesitated, his wide eyes fixed on Bailey, before finally following him back to safety. When Bailey returned, the herd had reached a wider section of the path, offering a brief moment of relief. The animals were visibly exhausted, their breaths coming in heavy gasps. Bailey walked among them, his tail wagging slightly as he checked on each animal. Despite his own exhaustion, he showed no signs of slowing down. The fire continued to advance, its flames casting flickering shadows on the canyon walls. Bailey barked sharply, urging the herd to keep moving. He knew there was no time to rest. From their position on the hill, John and Linda watched in silent awe. "He's saving them," John said quietly. Linda nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "He's their guardian angel." The fire roared closer, its fierce heat radiating even across the plateau. Bailey stood at the front of the herd, his ears perked and his sharp eyes fixed on the path ahead. The animals shuffled nervously, their movements restless as the threat grew nearer. Bailey sniffed the air, his instincts guiding him. He could sense the safest route, even as the flames encroached on their position. Without hesitation, he barked sharply and began leading the herd toward a narrow gap between two rocky outcroppings. The path was steep and uneven, but it provided a way to bypass the worst of the fire. John and Linda watched anxiously from their vantage point. "Where's he taking them?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. "To safety," John replied, though his own voice was heavy with uncertainty. "We have to trust him." The narrow gap was difficult to navigate, with jagged rocks jutting out at awkward angles. The sheep and cows hesitated, their hooves slipping on the unstable ground. Bailey darted among them, barking encouragement and nudging stragglers forward. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the canyon as a flaming branch fell from above, landing dangerously close to the group. The animals bolted in different directions, their panic threatening to scatter them across the treacherous terrain. Bailey acted swiftly, sprinting toward the sheep and cows that had strayed. He barked urgently, his voice cutting through the chaos. One by one, he brought them back to the main group, his determination never wavering. With the animals back together, Bailey resumed his position at the front of the herd. His body moved with urgency, but his actions were calculated and precise. The narrow path eventually opened into a broader trail, where the footing was more stable. The fire was still visible, but the distance between the flames and the herd had grown. The animals began to calm, their bleating and lowing subsiding as they followed Bailey's lead. Linda, watching from the hill with binoculars, let out a shaky breath. "They're moving away from the fire," she said, her voice filled with hope. John nodded, his eyes fixed on Bailey. "That dog's doing what no one else could. He's saving them." As the herd reached the end of the trail, they emerged onto a wide, grassy plain. The fire was now far behind them, its glow fading into the distance. The animals began to relax, their heads lowering to graze on the untouched grass. Bailey walked among them, his body weary but his spirit unbroken. He nudged a young lamb that had collapsed from exhaustion, encouraging it to rise and join the others. John and Linda arrived moments later, their truck pulling up near the edge of the plain. They stepped out, their faces a mix of relief and awe as they approached Bailey. "You did it, boy," John said, kneeling to stroke Bailey's soot-covered fur. "You saved them all." Bailey wagged his tail weakly, his eyes closing briefly as he finally allowed himself a moment of rest. The herd was safe, but Bailey's journey wasn't over. His loyalty and courage had carried them through the worst of the wildfire, and he remained their vigilant protector. As John and Linda tended to the animals, Bailey lay at the edge of the plain, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of further danger. Even in exhaustion, Bailey's devotion never wavered. The herd grazed on the grassy plain, seemingly safe after their harrowing journey. The air was cooler here, and the smoke from the wildfire had thinned. Bailey lay at the edge of the plain, his head resting on his paws as he watched the animals. He was exhausted but vigilant, his instincts warning him that the danger wasn't over. John and Linda moved among the sheep and cows, checking for injuries and ensuring they were hydrated. "They're lucky to have made it this far," John said, wiping sweat and soot from his brow. "Thanks to Bailey," Linda replied, glancing toward the dog. But as the sun began to set, the wind shifted once more, bringing with it the acrid smell of smoke. Bailey stood abruptly, his ears perking as he sniffed the air. He barked sharply, drawing the miller's attention. "What is it, boy?" John asked, turning toward the horizon. A distant glow appeared through the trees. The fire had found its way to the grassy plain, and it was advancing faster than before, driven by the unpredictable winds. The animals sensed the danger almost immediately. The sheep began to bleat loudly, clustering together in tight groups, while the cows stomped their hooves and mooed nervously. Bailey sprang into action, barking and circling the herd to keep them calm. Linda grabbed John's arm. "We can't stay here. The fire's heading straight for us." John nodded grimly. "We need to move them now, but there's no clear path out of here." Bailey barked again, louder this time, as if urging them to follow him. He trotted toward the far edge of the plain, where a narrow trail disappeared into a dense grove of trees. "Do you think that's the way out?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. "It's our only option," John replied. "Let's trust him." Bailey took the lead, guiding the animals toward the trail. The grove of trees was thick and dark, with branches that hung low and brushed against the backs of the taller cows. The ground was uneven, strewn with fallen leaves and debris, making the path difficult to navigate. The fire roared closer, its orange glow casting flickering shadows among the trees. Bailey barked constantly, urging the herd forward even as the flames licked at the edge of the grove. One of the sheep stumbled over a root, its frightened bleating echoing through the grove. Bailey rushed to its side, nudging it back to its feet and guiding it toward the group. John and Linda followed closely, their hearts pounding as they watched Bailey's tireless efforts. "He's incredible," Linda whispered, her eyes welling with tears. "He won't stop until they're safe," John replied, his voice filled with awe. The fire continued to advance, the heat pressing against their backs as they moved deeper into the grove. Bailey knew they couldn't slow down now. The grove of trees, though offering temporary cover, became increasingly difficult to navigate. Low-hanging branches clawed at the animals' backs, and the ground was littered with fallen limbs and ash. Bailey moved with unwavering determination, barking and guiding the herd through the labyrinth of obstacles. Suddenly, a loud crack shattered the air as a flaming branch fell from the canopy above, landing dangerously close to the herd. The sheep scattered, their panicked bleating filling the grove. The cows, startled, began to shift uneasily, their heavy bodies pressing against one another. "Bailey, get them back together," John shouted, his voice strained as he tried to keep up. Bailey sprang into action, weaving through the chaos with incredible agility. He barked sharply, nudging sheep back toward the main group and snapping at the heels of cows to redirect them. One by one, the animals regrouped, their trust in Bailey overriding their fear. As the herd pressed forward, the trail narrowed into a steep incline, flanked by dense underbrush. The incline was rocky and uneven, and the sheep struggled to find footing. Bailey climbed ahead, stopping occasionally to bark encouragement as the animals followed. One of the larger cows hesitated at the base of the incline, its large hooves slipping on the loose rocks. Bailey ran back to the cow, his sharp barks urging it forward. The cow let out a low moo, finally taking a cautious step upward. Linda, watching from behind, held her breath. "If they fall here," she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "They won't," John said firmly, his eyes fixed on Bailey. "He won't let them." Midway up the incline, the trail was blocked by a large fallen tree, its trunk charred and still smoldering. The animals stopped abruptly, their path cut off. Bailey approached the obstacle, sniffing around its edges as he assessed the situation. "What now?" Linda asked, her voice tinged with panic. John looked at Bailey. "He'll find a way." Bailey barked sharply, signaling the herd to stay put. He squeezed through a narrow gap between the tree and the underbrush. Emerging on the other side, he barked again, louder this time, to encourage the animals to follow. The sheep, though hesitant, began to squeeze through the gap one by one. The cows followed, their larger frames making the passage more difficult. Bailey stayed on the other side, barking to guide them through. The flames, carried by the wind, crept closer to the grove. The heat was intense, and the air was thick with smoke. Bailey worked tirelessly, ensuring every animal made it through the gap before moving on. The last sheep stumbled as it emerged on the other side, but Bailey was there to catch it, nudging it gently back to its feet. The herd was reunited, but the fire was dangerously close. "We have to keep going," John said urgently, his voice cutting through the crackling of flames. Bailey barked in agreement, leading the herd forward once more. The path widened briefly, but the fire's relentless advance gave the group little time to rest. The glow of flames illuminated the night, casting eerie shadows across the trees. The air was thick with smoke, making it difficult to breathe. Bailey pressed forward, his barks sharp and insistent as he led the herd. The animals' exhaustion was evident. Their movements were slower, and some of the sheep stumbled frequently, their legs trembling from fatigue. Bailey darted among them, barking encouragement and nudging stragglers to keep them moving. John and Linda followed closely, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. "We're running out of time," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, his jaw set. Bailey knows. He's pushing them as hard as he can. Ahead of them lay a narrow stream, its waters reflecting the fiery sky. The stream was shallow, but the edges were steep and muddy, making it a treacherous crossing for the tired animals. Bailey reached the stream first, his paws sinking slightly into the mud as he waded across. He barked sharply, signaling the herd to follow. The sheep were the first to step into the water, their hooves splashing as they navigated the slippery banks. One of the lambs hesitated, its small frame trembling as it stood at the edge. Bailey returned to its side, nudging it gently until it took its first tentative step. The cows followed, their larger bodies making the crossing more difficult. The mud clung to their hooves, and some slipped as they climbed the opposite bank. Bailey stayed close, guiding each one safely across. As the last of the cows reached the far side, a loud crack echoed through the grove. A flaming tree toppled into the stream behind them, sending up a shower of sparks. The herd panicked, their movements frantic as they scrambled away from the falling debris. Bailey acted quickly, running among the animals to calm them. He barked rhythmically, his tone firm but reassuring. Slowly, the herd began to settle, their trust in Bailey once again overriding their fear. John and Linda reached the far side of the stream just as the fire consumed the trail behind them. "That was too close," Linda said, her voice shaking. John placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes fixed on Bailey. "He's keeping them together. That dog's a miracle." With the stream behind them, the herd regrouped and pressed onward. The fire was still visible, but the distance between them and the flames had grown. The animals moved more steadily now, their confidence bolstered by Bailey's unwavering presence. Bailey paused briefly at the edge of the trail, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain ahead. He barked once, a sound filled with determination, before leading the herd forward once more. The journey wasn't over, but they were closer to safety than ever before. As the trail opened into a wider field, the fire's roar began to fade into the background. The herd stepped onto the grassy expanse, their hooves crunching softly against the dry ground. Bailey paused, his chest rising and falling with each heavy breath as he scanned the horizon. In the distance, faint lights flickered, a sign of the evacuation zone. The sight reignited hope in John and Linda, who had been following closely. "There it is," John said, his voice thick with relief. "We're almost there." Linda wiped her soot-streaked face, her eyes welling with tears. "Bailey, you've done it," she whispered. Bailey barked sharply, as though acknowledging her words, and began guiding the herd toward the lights. The field, though flat and open, was still riddled with hidden dangers. Small pockets of smoldering embers dotted the ground, remnants of the fire's earlier passage. The sheep hesitated near one particularly hot patch, their movements jittery. Bailey was relentless. He barked and darted around the herd, carefully steering them away from the hazards. His focus never wavered, even as the smoke thickened again, carried by a sudden shift in the wind. The cows, their large frames moving steadily forward, seemed to gain confidence from Bailey's leadership. One particularly stubborn cow stopped abruptly, its massive body blocking the path. Bailey ran back to it, barking loudly and nipping at its leg until it began to move again. The lights of the evacuation zone grew brighter, but so did the glow of the fire behind them. The wind had turned once more, pushing the flames closer to the field. Bailey quickened his pace, urging the herd to move faster. John and Linda, now walking behind the animals, exchanged worried glances. "We're so close," Linda said, her voice trembling. "But the fire's gaining on us." John replied grimly, "We have to keep moving." Bailey barked sharply, rallying the herd for one final push. The sheep and cows responded, their movements hurried as they followed him toward the lights. When the group finally reached the edge of the evacuation zone, rescue workers rushed to meet them. The area was a flurry of activity, with vehicles, firefighters, and volunteers working to assist evacuees. Bailey stopped at the boundary, his tail wagging slightly as he watched the herd enter the safe zone. The animals, though exhausted, were alive and unharmed. A firefighter approached John and Linda, his eyes wide with amazement. "You got the whole herd out? And that dog led them?" John nodded, placing a hand on Bailey's back. "We wouldn't have made it without him." The rescue workers helped settle the animals into a secure area, providing water and food. Bailey, despite his exhaustion, refused to rest until he had checked on every sheep and cow. Linda knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his soot-covered body. "You saved them, Bailey," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved us all." Bailey leaned into her embrace, his body finally relaxing. He had done his job, and now, surrounded by the family and herd he had fought to protect, he was truly home. The evacuation zone buzzed with activity as the Miller family and their animals settled into the safe area. The sun rose over the horizon, casting a golden light on the weary but grateful faces of those who had escaped the wildfire. Bailey lay in the shade of a large tent, his eyes half closed as he rested for the first time in what felt like days. His body was covered in soot, and his paws were raw from the grueling journey, but his spirit remained unbroken. John and Linda sat nearby, watching over Bailey and their herd. "He's a miracle, Linda," John said, his voice soft. "I don't know how he did it." Linda nodded, tears filling her eyes. "He gave everything he had for them. For us, we owe him everything." A veterinarian working at the evacuation zone approached the Millers, crouching down to inspect Bailey. "This is the dog everyone's been talking about," she said with a smile. John chuckled. "Yeah, that's Bailey. He's the real hero." The veterinarian gently examined Bailey, checking his paws and brushing away some of the soot from his fur. "He's a tough one, but he's been through a lot. He'll need rest and care to fully recover." Linda stroked Bailey's head as he lay still, his tail wagging faintly. "We'll make sure he gets everything he needs." Meanwhile, the sheep and cows were being cared for by volunteers. Fresh water and food were provided, and the animals slowly began to recover from their ordeal. One of the rescue workers approached John. "You managed to save all of them?" he asked, clearly impressed. "Not me," John replied, gesturing toward Bailey. "It was all him. He led them through everything, the fire, the rocky paths, everything." The worker smiled, shaking his head in amazement. "He's a special dog. You don't see that kind of loyalty and courage every day." As the day progressed, the Millers took a moment to reflect on what they had been through. Sitting together under the shade of a tree, they talked about the challenges they had faced and the incredible role Bailey had played. Linda looked at Bailey, who had finally fallen into a deep sleep. "I remember the day we brought him home," she said. "He was just a little pup, chasing his tail and chewing on everything he could find. I never imagined he'd grow up to be this." John smiled. "He's more than we ever could have hoped for. He's family." Bailey stirred slightly in his sleep, letting out a soft sigh. Despite the trials they had faced, the Millers knew they were fortunate to have made it through together, with Bailey leading the way. Word of Bailey's heroism spread quickly throughout the evacuation zone and beyond. Families who had also fled the wildfire came to see the dog that had led an entire herd of animals to safety. Some brought small gifts, treats, toys, or just heartfelt thanks for his bravery. A local journalist arrived to interview the Millers. Her notebook was already brimming with details about the wildfire, but it was Bailey's story that captured her attention. "So, you're telling me he led the entire herd through the fire on his own?" the journalist asked, her pen poised above her paper. John nodded. "Every step of the way. He found the paths, kept the herd together, and didn't stop until we were safe," Linda added, her voice emotional. "He's always been part of our family, but what he did out there, it's beyond what any of us could have imagined. He saved our livelihood, our animals, and more importantly, he gave us hope." The journalist smiled warmly. "The world needs stories like this. I'll make sure everyone knows about Bailey's courage." A few days later, the evacuation center organized a small ceremony to honor those who had gone above and beyond during the wildfire. Firefighters, volunteers, and first responders were recognized for their bravery, but it was Bailey who stole the show. The organizer, a local community leader, stood at the front of the gathering. "Today, we're not just honoring people," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "We're honoring a very special member of our community, a dog who reminded us all of what it means to be courageous and loyal in the face of danger." She gestured for John to bring Bailey forward. The crowd erupted in applause as John led Bailey onto the makeshift stage. Bailey, his coat now clean and his paws bandaged, stood tall, his tail wagging slightly as he looked out at the crowd. "For his incredible bravery and dedication, we present Bailey with this medal," the organizer continued, holding up a small gold medallion engraved with the words, "Courage Beyond Measure." As the medal was placed around Bailey's neck, the crowd cheered, children waved, and adults snapped photos, eager to capture the moment. Bailey's amber eyes sparkled in the sunlight, his expression calm but proud. After the ceremony, the Millers returned to their temporary shelter, where the animals were being housed. Bailey walked among the herd, his steps slow but steady. The sheep and cows seemed to recognize him as their protector, nuzzling him gently as he passed. John watched with a smile. "They know he's the reason they're here," he said. Linda nodded. "And so do we." Bailey paused near a young lamb that had struggled during their journey. The lamb looked up at him, letting out a soft bleat. Bailey licked its face gently before lying down beside it, his body finally at rest. As the wildfire was finally brought under control, families began to return to their homes. The Millers, along with their herd and Bailey, made the journey back to their farm. The air was still heavy with the scent of smoke, and the once vibrant fields were now scorched and blackened. John parked the truck at the edge of their property, stepping out to survey the damage. "It's not as bad as I feared," he said, his voice a mix of relief and determination. Linda stood beside him, her hand resting on Bailey's head. "We'll rebuild," she said softly. "We have each other, and we have Bailey." Bailey, as if understanding her words, wagged his tail and trotted ahead to inspect the property. Over the following weeks, the Millers worked tirelessly to restore their farm. Neighbors and volunteers from the community pitched in, helping to repair fences, clear debris, and replant crops. Bailey was a constant presence, overseeing every task with his usual vigilance. The sheep and cows, now grazing on the recovering land, seemed to thrive under Bailey's watchful eye. He was no longer just their protector. He was their leader, a role he embraced wholeheartedly. One afternoon, as Linda planted new saplings along the edge of the field, she paused to watch Bailey herding the sheep. "He's incredible," she said to John, who was mending a fence nearby. John smiled. "He's the heart of this place. I don't think we could do it without him." News of Bailey's heroism continued to spread, reaching far beyond their small community. Animal rescue organizations and wildlife charities used his story to raise awareness about the importance of animals in disaster situations. The Millers were often asked to speak about Bailey at events, sharing their experience and emphasizing the bond between humans and animals. Linda always ended her talks with the same sentiment. "Bailey didn't just save our farm, he saved our family. He reminded us what loyalty and courage truly mean." Bailey's story inspired many people to adopt animals from shelters, recognizing the incredible potential of every dog, no matter their background. One crisp autumn evening, the Millers gathered on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the farm. The fields were beginning to return to life, with fresh grass sprouting and trees showing signs of new growth. Bailey lay at their feet, his head resting on his paws. He was older now, his coat streaked with gray, but his eyes still held the same sharp intelligence and unyielding loyalty. Tommy, the Miller's young nephew, sat beside Bailey, stroking his fur. "He's the best dog in the world," Tommy said, his voice filled with admiration. Linda smiled, her gaze soft. "He's more than that, Tommy. He's family." As the stars began to twinkle above, Bailey let out a contented sigh, surrounded by the people and animals he had fought so hard to protect. For him, there was no greater reward